Hi, hello. Good morning, everyone who is listening to this podcast. At this very moment, we would like to have a discussion. Of course, this will be an interesting discussion. A series of podcasts, what is called Humanity Talk inside ASEAN podcast series. And at this very time, the title it will be Understanding Humanitarian Challenges and Approaches in ASEAN. Are we ready? That's a big question actually for ASEAN or Southeast Asia, sorry, as a region in the middle of crisis, especially humanitarian crisis. This morning, I would like to introduce to you as well our guest, let's say that way, Mr. Dino Satria. I know him quite well, again, and also the capacity where I know him as when we worked together under the same organization, and he was the field director in one of impacted areas in Palu, Central Sulawesi, and also humanitarian director in one organization. I can say the name of the organization is Save the Children. Well, when we talk about humanitarian crisis in Southeast Asia, like at least there are four that we can identify. The first one, the crisis because of the conflict. The second one, because of the disease outbreak, just like the one we have right now, still going on, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then climate change. And some organizations call it climate crisis. And then natural disasters. So these four creates crisis, humanitarian crisis that need to be responded, need to be addressed, and need to be engaged in terms of stakeholders, partners, and any resources available and possible to ensure that the response is right and the impact in the future will be minimized. So there are at least 5 things we would like to discuss this morning at this podcast. One is about the challenges in Southeast Asia region. How about the principle in ASEAN in line with the humanitarian crisis response itself? The third one, of course, one of the stakeholders is CSOs or NGOs, many say it's NGOs. How are they playing their role in that context, humanitarian context? And financing, of course, this is very important. So financing is like enabler. So if financing, if fund is sufficient, we hope that the response is much better. And the last thing is, as mentioned in the title, are we ready? The readiness of the ASEAN. So when we talk about the modalities in ASEAN, at least in my understanding, we have the policies like ADMER, ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. This is one, of course, important policies leading to humanitarian or guiding the humanitarian responses in ASEAN, Southeast Asia level. The second one, there's also one approach, what is called as one ASEAN, one response. So whether there is the crisis in a region or outside region, ASEAN must come as one to respond to that crisis. And also there's AHA Center. So this is the center that established to coordinate these responses, humanitarian responses. So with this in place, the crisis, there's modalities in place, how actually those 5 factors, 5 things that I mentioned before, but the challenges, how principle influence that, and so on. So, Mr. Dino, okay, so I hope you are well, and I can see that your fresh face and so on, and I'm sure that we will have a very good engagement right now. Okay, so I would like to ask you Mr. Pak Dino, I call you Pak Dino, okay? Is it okay? Atau Bang Dino? Bang Dino, okay.
Well, Bang would be better, but Dino
Okay.
is also fine as well. I don't mind to be called my first name, it's fine. I think they're also at the same age, right?
Yeah, you're right. Okay, Dino, okay. So with those in place, as I mentioned before, the policies and the stakeholders, and then the challenges, the four crises I mentioned before. So according to you, what are the challenges available? What is the challenges in existence in terms of responding to humanitarian crisis in Southeast Asia region? Please.
Okay. So I will answer this with a question as well, to start our critical thinking. So I think to respond to that question, it occurs to me another question. So what is the shape and also the size of the humanitarian system globally, and also and then regionally, for example, for ASEAN, for example.
Yeah.
But before that, let's see those challenges and break it down so we can see how that also affect the shape and also the size of the humanitarian system as well. You mentioned about COVID-19. Yes, definitely. The challenge is COVID-19. COVID-19 is still here, right?
Yeah.
And also has dramatically changed the scale, the geography of the humanitarian need globally, and the capacity of economy of countries to support within their own country or abroad. It's also being challenged. And this is also challenging the way we do our response, the old model of response, and also in bringing new way of responding. Of course, the pandemic, now we felt it socially and economically, the shockwave of the pandemic across the world into all areas from education, health. We also hear about domestic violence increases, poverty increases, etc. Even though the Western government has increased financial contribution to address this impact, but it's also placed pressure and support to other crises. Right. So that is the first challenge about the COVID-19.
Okay.
And you mentioned about the financing, right? And this is also affect the financing of the humanitarian assistance globally. And second challenge is about the climate and disaster. Well, the pandemic is still here. The existing risk and also the threats did not go away, unfortunately. It's still here. We've seen and also seeing a lot of climate-related disaster happening all across the globe, as well as in the region. Indonesia, for example, we've had lots of floods for this past 2 months, right?
Yeah.
Not to mention the earthquake that happened just recently in Cianjur. And this also has put a lot of pressure as well. And according to the IPCC report, this climate change is contributing to humanitarian crisis, including driving increases in displacement, food security, and malnutrition. So these are also the challenges that we are facing right now. Conflicts, you mentioned about conflicts, protracted conflict continue to happen around the globe, yeah?
Yeah.
And as well in the Southeast Asia region, new conflict is escalating, for example, in Myanmar, where we have 15 years of development and democracy all of a sudden is gone, and push millions of people, civilians, into a crisis as well, and adding and making it worse, which already happened, which Myanmar already have the protracted conflict situation that happened, right? For example, in Rakhine State and etc. So these are also the driving forces as well. The war in Ukraine also has an impact on the funding situation. A lot of attention and also a lot of funding goes to Ukraine as well. But this is also a question to the international donors, where there are still other crises that happen in around the globe that needs also attention. So this also question how the international donor and society can prioritize and also support other crises around the globe. Displacement as well. Displacement, if we see the global refugee crisis, a lot of developing countries is hosting displaced population, including in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia hosted around 2.1 million forced migrants, yeah, in 2021, including Indonesia as well. We have around 12,000, if not mistaken, or 13,000 refugees in Indonesia. And the problem is also the challenge. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are not signatories to the international refugee treaties, and they haven't developed a mechanism to coordinate policy responses to refugee population. This is also one of the challenges that we are facing right now. And another challenge is the civic space, yeah, or the civil society space that is being, how do you say, shrinking, yeah, shrinking. As you can see globally as well, but also there's lots of civil society movement, new movement that is being raised right now. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, and we also see the protests in Myanmar, Malawi, etc. And this form of action is also trying to resist this, protest to the human system that is happening right now. So the question is there a support beyond the system? So we need also to look to other ways of doing response, not only looking into the system, but also outside the system. So explore new networks, explore community-based action. I think this is also one of the areas that we can together explore opportunities. As for ASEAN, well, I think there are already many achievements in terms of building resources, capacities, including financial, in preparedness and response, which ASEAN has been able to deliver humanitarian assistance through the implementation of ADMER as well. And a lot of success also is credited to AHA Center as well as the operating entity of the ADMER. Yeah. However, the ASEAN principle are often questioned, as is this humanitarian mechanism is not designed to respond. It was designed to respond to natural disasters. So it's been a challenge if the Asian community responding to, for example, conflict situation. Yeah. Okay. As we have seen in the past years, how the humanitarian access is constrained in Myanmar, and it raises a question: should ASEAN reform its principle and mandate?
I see.
Right.
Okay.
Well, if we want to reach people in need, then we need to, solve the problem. If it's the principle and mandate that is being as a bottleneck, then the question is, should ASEAN reform its principle and mandate, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Pak Dino, especially your last statement, that now the dynamics of the crisis triggered by many factors, and then the crisis like overlap, okay, triggered by, like say, disease outbreak, and then exacerbated, okay, by climate crisis, and then comes natural disaster. And as policies, ATMER is designed, if I'm not mistaken, okay, it says that it's for natural disaster. What about the other conflicts? Is that agreement is ready for responding for the crisis? I mean, other than natural, triggered by natural disaster. And then also you mentioned about that the system seems that it's not responding well in terms of that it's the principles and so on. So, as you mentioned before, that should ASEAN reform or reform mandate for the mandate and the approach? So, it's actually in ASEAN there are two basic core principles, which is the first one is non-interference. So, if there's something happen in ASEAN member states, and the other members cannot automatically, okay, interfere. And the second one is consensus-based. So to move forward with a decision, every member must agree. Okay, so if there is one disagree, it cannot move forward. So how do you see these two principles, if I may use the word, constrain the humanitarian responses? Is there something that you say previously, should ASEAN reform its mandate or also approaches? So what do you say about that?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, the two principles often constrained ASEAN to respond to the crisis. And is there any other options, right? Support beyond the system, like I mentioned. I think ASEAN should also explore other ways of responding, whether it is working with international NGOs or local NGOs, whether combining forces with the UN agencies to put also pressure and advocate globally to provide humanitarian access. These kind of things that I think ASEAN also can do. And it also depends on the strong leadership as well in ASEAN, and how that leadership can provide good direction consensusly, and to make way and provide humanitarian access to people in need. Because what's the point of having humanitarian response if we cannot respond, right? Yeah. So I think it needs to seek other ways beyond the system. That's my point. I think there is other ways. A lot of local NGOs is still working on the ground, even though there's lots of constraints. Even sending money to Myanmar is difficult, right? And that is the challenge of the situation there in Myanmar. and we need to find ways, and also the role of civil society, such as international NGOs to support that effort is also critical as well.
I see. Okay, so that principle is really some way or somehow quite a constraint to the work of humanitarian. So you suggest that there will be another way, so open access and so on. So to other stakeholders like international organization, UN and CSOs. Okay, so the CSO, okay, just like your organization, Church World Services, just like my organization, Save the Children, and many other CSOs working in the region. What role do you think they should play around this, situation? Okay, because yeah, one thing in Myanmar, it seems like it's hard to get into that. But what about others? Do they have the same? Let's say, I mean, other countries, do they apply the same approach in means limitation to like CSOs working? In Myanmar, it seems to be very limited, but what about others? And what do you think about what CSO must do in terms of getting into this difficult situation? I use the word difficult situation. I mean, the context of the location with limitations such as Myanmar.
Yeah, I think as CSO, international NGO and also NGOs working to support the effort in humanitarian relief in Myanmar. I think there are two ways that we can support. First is working cross-border, cross-borderly. Of course, there's lots of challenge in that. And as well, in terms of advocacy, advocating donors, advocating government to put pressure Myanmar to open its access. I think that's the two ways that we can do right now, and also supporting local organizations to keep working safely as well. There's lots of threats as well to NGO staff, local NGO staff working in Myanmar. So we also need to support them as well, not only financially, but also in safety and security as well. And providing the enabling environment to do that. So working with different actors as well, inside and outside the country. This, I think, could be done in supporting the effort.
Myanmar is one thing. It's we somehow agree that it's very limited and difficult, a lot of constraint to get into the country, even for humanitarian works or support. What about other 9 countries? Do you see the difference? And what do you think made that difference? Probably Indonesia is different from Myanmar, or Indonesia from Singapore and so on. So how do you see that?
I think one of the challenge, I think you have mentioned that, is the disparities of countries within ASEAN is different, right? And also socially, politically, has its own agenda and problems as well. For example, and I think the role of ASEAN should be expanded as well. Not, like I mentioned before, not only trying to respond natural disaster, but also
non-natural disaster,
man-made disaster as well. I think if you're asking, are we ready or not to respond in ASEAN, I would say partially. partially ready.
Right.
If natural disaster, I think we are ready, but outside of that, still a big question mark.
I see. So I would like to dig deeper about how actually the CSOs just like us. Okay, so we as organization as well, we do have our own situation, right? Okay, so and in context of Southeast Asia countries, ASEAN countries, do you think the work of CSOs like your organization and mine are welcome? Or do you think that they are like limited in general in the region? And if open, what causes of that? What the triggers so it's open? If it's closed or limited or a little bit constrained, what the triggers?
Yeah, I think it's open, but it's closed.
Okay, okay. It's quite interesting. Okay.
It's not really clear
Okay. Mm-hmm.
at the moment. For example, if you see Indonesia,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Indonesia CSO, of course, if you are a national NGO or local NGO, you can operate anywhere within the country, right?
Yeah.
But for international NGO, working in Indonesia is limited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are certain locations that you cannot work in parts of Indonesia.
Okay.
So that is already something, right? It's open, but it's closed as well. Yeah. Different country has different approach and system as well. But if we look at the increase of NGOs around the globe, it's already increases by 10%, I think, since 2013, if I'm not wrong. So this means that there's a lot of need, and also there's a lot of civil society movement that is happening around the globe because of many reasons, because of conflict, because of disparities, inequalities, and etc. So this is a sign that the CSO is still needed to provide the support and to voice our concern, right? But at the same time, there's also an increase of shrinking space of the CSO space, right? Civil society space. And the trigger can be many things, but political conflict is agenda is one of the area that is trigger that, and also democracy, human rights issues is also a lot of times is being pressured by state actors as well. And this is not only happening in ASEAN region, but also all over the globe. Right. So there's an increase of that, and the humanitarian needs also increases around the globe as well. And if we look at humanitarian financing, I think in my data, it was estimated $31 billion raised in 2021. That is almost double from one decade before. So there's also an increase of humanitarian agencies, like I mentioned before, 10% over a decade, yeah. And more humanitarian staff working in crisis context as well. But despite this growth, the system remains financially concentrated. So almost half of the international humanitarian assistance is just from 5 donors, actually.
Ah.
And the third came from US alone. And nearly half of that funding allocated to UN agencies. So there's a challenge there, right?
Yeah.
How this money reach to the communities or people in need, right? And how we decentralize that? Well, that's another question.
Yes. Okay. Very interesting with the numbers. Okay. So, in fact, there are numbers. More and more organizations working on humanitarian crisis, on the CSO working on that crisis, and the demand, the need is also increased like double compared to a decade ago. But unfortunately, okay, so 5 donors, 5 big donors, okay, and then through UN agencies. So when we talk about, there's one interesting emerging point actually being discussed or some partially implemented by organizations, the terms of localization. So CSO, okay, because the first responder is local, right? The local person, local government, okay, so they must be capacitated, and the funding must be channeled, most of them, to the local responder, which is actually can be translated to the what we call as CSOs. Okay, so in Indonesia as well, there are like organizations like us, and then also some local NGOs. We can find it everywhere in every province in Indonesia, and I believe in other countries as well in ASEAN there are some NGOs like that. The question is, when it comes to localization, is more still something the buzzword, but actually it's really hard to translate that into the action, and especially in our organization, we're still discussing it. So what do you think? Okay, when we talk about the CSO role, and at the same time we want to capacitate the local capacity with assumption, with thinking or a thought that they are the first responder. They must be able to respond quickly in the right way, and of course they must be capacitated in 2 ways. One is the expertise, and the second one is funding. How do you see that in being challenged, looking at you mentioned before that 50% of the humanitarian fund goes to UN agencies. How about the rest of us? How about the local NGOs? How do you see localization triggers the more decentralized funding? I mean, that the fund reaches the local CSOs.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned. I mean, since the Grand Bargain was launched, and the localization efforts that has been placed, I don't think much has been achieved so far, right? And this is, well, even though a lot of donors, a lot of organizations is signing to that Grand Bargain, but I think the commitment of donor agencies and also international NGOs needs to put into action, right? I don't think the action is as aggressive as it was planned before, and I think this is the role of international community to advocate that more funding channel through the local organization, support the locally led humanitarian action as well, support community-based organization, support local leaders in responding to disaster. I think this is also our role as CSO as well, to advocate that and to educate the international communities, including donors and also the UN agencies as well. And the commitment has to be built from them as well. Otherwise, this grand bargain or localization effort, we will not go anywhere.
So it means that, okay, so when every actor does not realize that, well, actually, they realize that, but it's not really translated into real actions. Like when localization, it means that, okay, we agree on that, the principle, we agree on that one, but the action is still not really responding to the awareness understanding, because there's still like, some of the fund pooled in certain organization. I guess you mentioned before, 50% of the fund is in UN agencies. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Also, ASEAN can, also support grand bargain and localization efforts, because, as you mentioned before, that the CSO has been essential partner to ASEAN as well. I think there's a APG.
It's ASEAN.
It consists of CSO in supporting the ADMER. But unfortunately, this APG is only limited to some organization, but not local or national organization. I think it should be more open as well.
I see. Okay. Well, even in ASEAN, there is it's like CSO communities, supporting this ADMER implementation, and of course supporting the government in implementing the agencies. Now we go deeper about the financing, Dino. So according to the report, it says the Global Humanitarian Overview 2022 that at least is needed like $50.8 billion for the crisis in ASEAN alone here, yeah? Okay. Sorry, it's globally, it says here, okay, so require 50.8 billion. If the size, I would like to compare, 50.8 billion is around 25% of Indonesia 2023 national budget. So it's huge. Okay, so Indonesia is national budget for 2023 is around $202 billion. So it's almost half of the country. And ASEAN has modalities actually, but unfortunately, I don't have the data about the size of the funding available right now. They have what we call it, I write here, ADMER Fund. Okay, so they also AHA Center Fund. And I understand that based, okay, when I was with the ASEAN, I understand like that everything must be similar in terms of responsibility and rights in ASEAN members. For example, like the membership fee, okay, it must be equal. It must be similar for all countries. I understand that some countries are able to pay more, but ASEAN don't do that. So in humanitarian, I guess it's the same. I mean, like if Myanmar pays, let's say, $100,000 US, other countries must pay the same, because it's the basis for consensus. You are not stronger, you are not more influential from other members, which is triggered by the size of fund you are contributing. Okay, but of course, as you mentioned before at the very beginning, that financing is still an issue here. and then what is that? The international support is still limited, especially in a country like Myanmar. So if we say that this funding is limited, if this funding is not sufficient to respond, okay, so the humanitarian work, of course, cannot be done sufficiently, let's say like that. So what do you see I would like to use the word new approach to provide more fund to this response? Is it like there's a pool of fund, or probably like bonds, for example, or when we talk about financing the risk, there are, I understand, like 4 or 5. One is using the national capacity, like Indonesia APBN, APBD, national and subnational budget. And the second one, using the catastrophe fund, let's see, it can be, and the third one, it can be insurance. And then the fourth is like support from big donors. So how do you think these 4 sources of financing could be combined or implemented in ASEAN level toward responding to the crisis, humanitarian crisis?
Very interesting question. Well, first of all, I'm not really familiar with the ADMIR Fund and the AHA Center Fund. But I think the question is how these funds flow through the system, right? How this fund flow through the system and reaching to the people in need. I think that is the big question. How this funds flow, because if we can see how the fund flows, then we know where's the gap is, right? How the channel goes from, for example, the ASEAN to the member states and then to the communities in needs. And also coming back to the grand bargain and localization efforts, I think it's also important that ASEAN needs to diversify its channel as well, not only to support the ASEAN member state countries, but also to reach out to CSO and local NGOs that is working on the ground, being the first responder, and also assisting communities from day one, for example. Because at the end of the day, the communities itself, who are the first responder, and we also should support the communities as a first responder. That is the first. The second is on disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. I think also funding should be allocated not only for responding, but also for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, or climate change to support the climate change mitigation as well. I think that's an important aspect that should be diversified. At the end of the day, we'll try to prepare and also mitigate before the disaster happens, right?
Yes, you're so right about that. So my understanding, it could be mistaken, but it says right now that humanitarian is not really about emergency response. Humanitarian is, if you talk about the crisis, is also the part of it is like mitigation and also recovery. So it's like that's the step. I don't say the sequence, okay, but that's the part, okay. It's like natural disaster. I've been quite understanding about disasters, and it must be mitigation and also the recovery and also the crisis. And the humanitarian now is like expanded to that, because some understanding that humanitarian means like relief is like emergency response. Okay, so far, but of course, I agree with you that it must be DRR. It's to me, it's like mitigation, and then what other triggers? What are the factors that make it worse, like climate change? Okay, it also must be addressed. Okay, so we see that a lot of factors here, a lot of like overlapping situation, even like moving from one disaster to another disaster, not to mention like small disaster. Indonesia alone, okay, also that's what I understand. Okay, so we see a lot of like small disaster that is not really like discussed a lot, but you see when it happens regularly, like flood, for example. If it happens every year, for example, of course, it increase the vulnerability of the people and decrease the capacity. So in that sense, all the things that we have discussed before, the challenges, the principles, and how actually actors are playing around that humanitarian issues in the region, and then the financing challenges, and what should be financed, what should be funded, you mentioned before, but also the DRR and also the climate change. With that context, with that thing, I put on the table, let's say that way. How ready is ASEAN? How ready are we as ASEAN, as Southeast Asian members country?
I think we are not ready fully.
Mm-hmm.
We are not fully ready, sorry.
Okay.
Like I mentioned before, in terms of capacity building, infrastructure building of ASEAN in responding to emergencies, ASEAN has already built that capacity, with ERA, etc., and then with the pre-processing stocks, warehouses, right? The infrastructure is ready, but I think the system needs to be diversified.
Okay.
To reach to the most vulnerable population in need in ASEAN.
Right.
And before that, we talked also about the question of should the ASEAN reform its civilian mandate as well.
Yes. So partially ready is quite an intriguing statement, actually. I guess so. Yeah, I see that. If I push myself to understand that, okay, I will see it from diversity of the capacity of each member. Like Singapore compared to like Myanmar, Indonesia compared to others, they have different capacities in terms of experiences, knowledge, access, and also funding. Do you think this, what do you call it, differences? Do you think this diverse capacity contributing to the what you mentioned before, that ASEAN is not fully ready?
Yes and no. In terms of ASEAN, I think ASEAN should work as a community.
Yeah.
Right? So working together, we know that there's differences, there disparities between capacities between member state countries. But of course, if they work together, then we can achieve the goal and objectives, right? But my question is more to the how the system is working, whether it's working or not, right? So the system, what I said is the system is working partially, only working when a natural disaster happens.
Okay.
But if it's beyond that, I don't think the ASEAN committees is ready.
All right. Thank you.
The system needs to be changed, basically, or diversified.
Okay. system should be modified, diversified. Okay. So, well, thank you, Mr. Dino. Okay. So it's very interesting discussion. I actually have a lot of questions in my mind. Okay. So, yeah, so I see still some issues, but of course, we can discuss it in other opportunities. So we have, with this time, yeah, so we talk about the overview, and the detail, of course, need more elaboration. And I agree with you, something that must be addressed, especially as you mentioned before, the system, the mandate. It's quite interesting, and I'm so delighted to have this message. Okay, partially, okay, yeah, as I understand from your explanation that okay, ASEAN is ready for natural disaster, but the crisis is not only triggered by the disaster, natural disaster. Others like pandemic COVID-19, it seems that it paralyzed us. Okay, so it seems that we could not do something to respond to that with like have to stop and so on. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Dino Satria, country representative for Indonesia and Timor Leste. You have this podcast series, and I would like to have some notes as a takeaway from this discussion. Okay, it's very interesting. We elaborate a lot of things, and then there's a new and fresh, even daring statement saying that we need to do something, okay, to be able to respond beyond the natural disaster. Okay, looking at the disparities among country members in terms of the limited of the access and also the capacity and also the even up to the financing capacity. So if I may take or notes or make 5 takeaway for our listeners. Okay, so I will present it like this. 1. So in ASEAN, we have still challenges in terms of responding to humanitarian crisis. Okay, the issues are very imminent. I mean, it's real, but of course, but the way we respond to that, the capacity, the system, the funding is still like not sufficient. So a lot of challenges need to be addressed. The second one, there is a sense that the principles being implemented now, especially the non-interference and consensus-based, are not really responding to the need of the humanitarian emergency or humanitarian response. You need more access, need more interference in terms of that push and what we call that to open more resources to move into a country that is affected by crisis and creating the humanitarian crisis. And the third one, TSOs as one of the stakeholders, one of actors, okay, in this work, okay, have the capacity and has the CSOs have the understanding based on the local situation they are dealing with in a single or everyday, let's say, single day basis. Like your organization, Church World Services, you work in some areas like Save the Children, like other organizations in other ASEAN member countries. They understand the areas, they have the network, they have the connection with the community as the first responder. But unfortunately, so far, when we move to the financing, it's not really sufficient in terms of the portion channel to them. Okay, as you mentioned before that 50% of the funding from big donors goes through UN agencies. So localization needs to be addressed well in terms of moving this capacity, including financing, to the local actors and including CSOs. And on the readiness, okay, so ASEAN, okay, Southeast Asia countries are partially ready. In terms of that, for natural disaster, we have the capacity, we are ready. But what about crisis triggered by other things, such as we mentioned before, the conflict, for example, and then the disease outbreak, just like what we are still having it right now. So the COVID-19 is still lurking us, so it's still following us everywhere. So we have to be aware on that, and so we have to modify our approach to be able to respond to that well. And climate change come into the table and create pressure, okay, to that humanitarian work. So we have to do the work as well, how to tackle the climate change impact, because it can exacerbate the crisis itself. And one thing that I totally agree, that probably ASEAN must look into the mandate and in terms of mechanism and so on, so they will be agile to respond to the humanitarian crisis in the future. And of course, according to many reports, the crisis is not decreasing, but it tends to increase. Okay, thank you very much for Dino, and for the audience who are listening to this podcast. And I am Rinsan Tobing, Senior Strategic Advocacy Manager, Save the Children Indonesia. I would like to thank you for your time and also for insights and comments. And I hope that this discussion is not done here, but of course we need to elaborate more. And you can take something from this discussion that, of course, contributing to the readiness of you as an individual, of us as a member, as a country, and also as ASEAN. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.